Hey, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
Today we're continuing our short series on careers in business and how they relate to personal growth, personal development, and obviously your personality type, because we're Personality Hacker. One of the things I want to talk about today is this notion of businesses being vested in social, moral, ethical issues in society, and how there's a new rise of this happening that we're seeing happen that's pretty brand new as far as a technology, I think, for all of our emerging society. I think this is a very new concept, a new idea. So let me unpack a little bit of an example for this, just to give you a context of what I'm actually talking about here. I was just reading this morning an article. There's in our country, the United States, where we live, there's a hotbed discussion going on right now at the time of this recording that's discussing the definition of what marriage means. So we've got a lot of people that are trying to come up and trying to put some clarity around how they would define what marriage means in a legal definition. Sometimes it's a spiritual or religious definition, but people are trying in this country right now. It's a very big discussion about what does marriage mean and how are we going to define being married.
Well, and the reason why is because there are people who would like to get married, who feel they have basic civil rights to be able to get married, and because of their sexual orientation, there's some backlash against whether or not they could define their unions as marriage. And so for some, it's a matter of, preserving a previously held belief around marriage, and for others, it's about gaining some civil liberties and whether or not they have a right to those.
Absolutely. Now, that's not what we're talking about today. It's going to be a tool for us to look at something else that we are going to be talking about today, which is this idea of businesses taking stances on social issues, which I believe is something fairly new that we're seeing emerge. So what's happening? We've got a political debate in Washington, D.C. and in the state capitals all over the United States, arguing about how the law, like actual laws, will be either written or interpreted. New laws are getting passed, new laws are getting overturned, judges are making determinations, and we've got a bunch of political and civic type discussions around this topic. But what's interesting, I think even more interesting than the civic discussions, are all the commerce discussions happening around this topic. And this is what I want to really focus in on today, because we have this series on business and career, and it's a really interesting thing that certain businesses, entire corporations, are now taking a stance on how they feel about marriage and the definition of marriage, and things like equality that come up in these discussions.
And because of this, it's so fascinating because of this almost sense of responsibility that customers believe the businesses that they patronize, they feel like these businesses have a responsibility to reflect the customers' values, or that the customers are voting with their dollar by either reflecting and matching or disagreeing with the company's stance on some of these major, these social issues. And so what's so interesting about that is I don't know how much of that vote with your dollar concept was implemented, in the past, even when there was a lot of civil unrest around social issues like in the 60s. I mean, I wasn't around in the 60s, so I don't really know if that was like a big deal, but it feels like companies are really being held accountable for the positions they take or the stances they take on some of these, some of these social issues. And that's fascinating because, like you mentioned, historically, these issues would have been fought on in a political landscape, which they are. And now we're adding the component of these issues being fought in a commercial landscape. And so businesses don't just have to provide products, services that are agreeable to their customers. Their customers are now also being critical of the positions they take in political and social issues. So, like take, for example, a company like Chick-fil-A. Chick-fil-A in the United States is a fast food restaurant that serves chicken, right? Fried chicken,
chicken sandwiches,
chicken sandwiches, right? And Chick-fil-A it has like famously good customer service and famously good food. And I mean, I don't know how responsible they try to be with where they source their chicken. So I'm not sure if they're like, famously responsible with how they source their meat. But I know that most people, they have favorable things to say about Chick-fil-A on a business level. But Chick-fil-A is owned by an evangelical Christian.
I believe so, yeah.
So, it's always closed on Sunday out of respect for the Lord's Day and to go to church. And also, they take a very clear stance on, being against gay marriage. So even though Chick-fil-A is kind of a well-known, well-run company, because of their political stance, people are either fully supporting them and going there more to support their political stance on the gay marriage issue, or they're boycotting it and they're definitively not spending money there, and they're quote unquote voting with their dollar because of Chick-fil-A's political stance. That has nothing to do with their service, their food, the quality of like the cleanliness of their restaurants, like all the traditional things that we judge a business around is not the major component here. It's where they fall on the gay marriage issue. The same thing with Oreos, right? Oreos recently took a pro stance for gay marriage. Or at least, I mean, I don't remember them specifically definitively being pro gay marriage. I just remember some of the evangelicals that I know were saying boycott Oreo because of this stance. So I'm assuming they were at least friendly on the topic. And so it's the same deal. Like, everybody loves Oreos, right? I mean, unless you're a nutritionist, then you probably hate Oreos. But if you are not a nutritionist and in the health and wellness industry, you probably at least buy a package of Oreos once a year. And there was, again, this schism about whether or not to purchase Oreos because of the stance the company took on a completely unrelated to the product issue.
Yeah.
So what's so fascinating about this, from my perspective, and I think this is basically where you're headed, is that companies are becoming more responsible for what their core values are, for the stances they take on, socially, ecological positions. They're being held accountable for their integrity, not just the integrity of their product, but the integrity of who they are as a company.
Yeah, well, and what's interesting is they're inserting themselves into these conversations. So again, I just want to be very clear. We're not talking about gay marriage or gay rights today, or the validity of, allowing that or not allowing that. So that's really not the topic. Just so you're clear, we're talking about businesses inserting themselves into social discussions. And this is a great framework to look at a social discussion that businesses are inserting themselves into, unnecessarily inserting themselves into on either side of it. When I say unnecessarily, I don't mean that they should never do that. I mean that they don't have to do that at this period of history in order to continue to make money and do business. It's a choice for them to do. Now, I believe there'll be a day coming when you do have a stance on certain issues, but I don't think it's necessarily needed right now to do that.
Well, and although there are some companies that are being thrown into the conversation whether they want to or not, usually they're smaller mom and pop stores that, there's this cake baking scenario, the pizza scenario. Like, would a pizza place that's owned by, a couple that take a position against gay marriage, would you cater our gay marriage wedding? And if you say no, then we're, now you're targeted, and vice versa. There's a lot of quote unquote targeting happening. So there are major corporations that are volunteering their positions and stances, and there are smaller, companies, mom and pop stores maybe, that are being thrust into it, whether they like to or not.
And so what I look at, and I see this, and I think I've had a conversation about this. We look at this and go, systems of government are breaking down so fast, and people have lost trust in being able to get things done using government and law and the rule of law and all these things, that they've turned on to the next level, which is commerce, business, trading, finance. This is where this discussion is now being held. It's no longer being held. I mean, it is obviously being held in the Senate, the Congress, at the White House. There still is civil discussion happening. But if you look at what the media is covering and what it's all whipped up into a frenzy right now, it's around the world of commerce. It's in the business world. It's in the transaction between service industries and companies producing products and fast food restaurants. I mean, when did in the 1960s civil rights have major corporations that were, going against? Maybe they did have this discussion going on, but nothing to the degree we have now in the world of commerce, where entire companies are taking stances on things.
Well, I think in the 60s when it was, racial situations, or like racial civil rights, companies were being held accountable for choosing not to hire people.
Correct.
And so there were companies that were thrust into the limelight.
Like we hire African American people. Basically, they would put out there to showcase their company's willingness to be racially integrated. Basically,
yeah, and their progressiveness, etc., or vice versa. They wouldn't.
Yeah,
and so they were. There was conversation around that. However, it feels like now. I mean, I've consulted with different companies that are considered very progressive in how they deal with their company culture. And things like core values, right? What the company stands for on a bigger level, what the ultimate end game goal of the company is, separated simply from whatever they're selling or their service. That's a big part. That's becoming a burgeoning topic for these companies. I think we did a podcast on like Zappos before, and how these core values are becoming more and more interesting to companies that want to make more money and attract talent. And we're also seeing what looks like entering a time period where it's not just going to be about, attracting talent or making more money. It's going to be that you need to make sure that you are representing your ideals and beliefs, and you need to be in integrity with that. You need to be in alignment. And people may start, I mean, we're speculating here. We have no idea where this is actually headed. But our speculation seems to be that people might choose to look for employment, seek employment with companies that are in alignment with our ideals, and refuse companies that are not. Or, it might not just be about voting with your dollar. It might be about where you choose to be employed and whether or not you're looking for companies that are in alignment with your ideals. And so what's fascinating about this when it comes to, say, models of development and personal development and, how you make your money, is this concept that it's not just a matter of trying to look for where the dollar is. It's a matter of finding the win-win between where your dollars come from and also being in alignment with your core values and principles as a person. So personal development almost feels like it's getting forced upon commerce. It's getting forced upon the commercial system. We're taking conversations not just from the political arena into commerce because we're tired of politics, which I do believe a lot of people are. I think it's also because we understand that those are the power, that's the power leverage right there. That's really where people focus a lot of attention when it comes to, who runs the company there, or excuse me, who runs the country. There's a lot of, conspiracy theories around how both, if you're going to look at partisan politics, that both candidates for the presidency are bought by the same companies, right? There's a lot of concepts around that, and there's potentially some validity to that. And so we look to companies as being the big power brokers. And so if we want to get things moving, then we're going to have to look to the real power brokers of the commercial system, and we're going to have to force their hands at being in alignment with values and being in integrity.
What's interesting is that force is coming not from the government telling them they have regulations often. It's coming from the hearts and minds of people saying, if I'm going to be a part of this company, if I'm going to buy your product, or if I'm going to work for you, these are my core values, and the people that are working for you are buying your product's core values. And we expect you as a company now to be a representative of our values in order for us to do business with you or to work with you. Almost as if they're a representative government in a sense. This is real abstract what I just said, but we almost look at them as representatives of us in a commercial system. And I think about if I ever had to get a corporate job again, going into a corporation, I would be very careful to pick a corporation that was in alignment with my values. And maybe this is a statement that I'll end up retracting someday, but I'll say it here. If I go to work at a corporation and they ask me to put my urine into a cup and hand it over to them to examine my bodily fluids, I will say no to that, because now I've gotten to a place where that is a core value of mine. I'm not going to hand over my bodily fluids to a corporation or to any company, that's mine. I own that. I get to do what I want with that. That's not yours that you get to manage or manipulate or test to see who I am. Like that's not cool. And I'm noticing a lot more people are feeling these kinds of ways. Like we're starting to say, if a company wants me to sell my soul to them, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to pick a career where they honor my values. And I want to pick a company that honors the things I stand for and the values I stand for. And I think smart companies are getting onto this. They're starting to say, you know what, we as a company stand for something. We're not just making, hamburgers or chicken sandwiches, or we're not just making Oreos, or we're not just, producing whatever product or service. We also have a mimetic product we produce. And that mimetic product, that idea virus product that we produce as a company, is just as important as the physical product we produce or the service we provide, which is really interesting.
We were discussing how this is a reflection of how society is leveling up in the Graves levels, the Graves model. If you haven't listened to our podcast, we do this a lot. We reference the Graves model podcast all the time. So if you're a regular podcast listener and you haven't listened to that one, just go back and listen to it because we're forever referencing it. I think it's like episode 22 of our podcast. And there is a clear, like before, we were talking about how governments were the power brokers of, what is considered appropriate civically or not. And that was a very Graves 4 level way of handling things. And you can see that by taking this conversation, I mean, we still have it there, but also inserting, like forcibly, socially inserting this conversation into the commercial system. That's a very Graves 5 way of looking at things. That means our social conversations are now on the platform of, of commerce, of capitalism, of basically Graves 5. And what's fascinating about that is we're probably going to get through that pretty quick because the conversation isn't just about, how to make your money. The conversation is, again, about ideals and values. That's now peeking into Graves 6. So what we're seeing sort of a blitz force, almost like a really awkward transition period, which all transition periods are awkward. We're seeing this awkward transition period of going from Graves 5 to Graves 6 as like a society. And that's why we're getting these conversations happening in the commercial system. Now, that's all very, we're pretty zoomed out here. This is all very abstract conversation. These are just kind of ideas that were really striking us. But to bring it back down to the personal level, I think what's going to do for us as individuals is it's going to bring more responsibility on us to know what we stand for as people and to ask ourselves if we really know what our core values are. Have we been outsourcing how we feel? Do we know what we stand for? And are we going to make sure that our way of making a living, our livelihood, is in integrity with our core values? Because that conversation is going to be brought to us. Just like those smaller companies, those mom and pop stores, they're having the conversation be brought to them. They didn't ask for that, right? Like they're just doing their thing. They're just making cakes or pizza or whatever. And then all of a sudden this social issue gets dumped in their lap, right? Regardless of how you feel about it, it came to them. And I think that's probably going to happen more and more, is that these social issues are going to be coming to us in our livelihood. And if our livelihood is threatened, are we in integrity with our values enough so that, like when it happens to us, right? If it were to, and I'm not even saying that you necessarily have to be like a small business owner. I'm just saying if the conversation comes to you, are you going to be able to stand in integrity with what your values are? Have you thought about them? Do you know who you are enough? Have you done enough inner personal development work to be able to go, I am in alignment with how I make my money. I am mimetically and spiritually and, in all other ways in alignment with how I am, making my livelihood and taking care of myself and my family.
That's easy to say as I'm sitting here listening to us talk. At the time of this recording, in an economy that is at least perceived to be a difficult economy where it's hard to get a job for a lot of people. There's a lot of, at least in our country, the United States, there's a lot of people out of work. A lot of people, these are professionals that have skill, and there's often a lot of unemployment going on right now. People can't get work. And it's like, I would be happy with any job, someone might say, because I'm starving. My family needs food and we need resource. And you're asking me now to be selective of where I work. If a company that wants to hire me is against my core values, man, I certainly want to be in integrity, but I also need to eat. So this is a tough decision for me.
Well, there's a core value of not, starving.
Yeah.
That's a core value too, of being able to take care of your family.
Well, and that's something to think about as you're moving through this landscape. And it seems like like you said, we're in this transition period where we're going to see this come up more and more. And I think we're going to have more resources and tools on how to deal with this, because this is I could see a day where probably on your resume, you put some kind of statement of your values or something. And companies, when they're hiring, put a statement of their values in a sense before they hire and say, before we even talk about the job, do our values match here? Do we see eye to eye on the values we bring to the world? And then we can talk about the job and the pay and all that stuff. But it almost like the conversation, I can see a day when it starts with, you're a person and we're a company, and do we match up mimetically on these things? Because otherwise it's not going to be a culture fit. It's more about culture, more about values. And I think that day is coming very rapidly. The other thing that's interesting about all of this is that, in a civic discussion, this discussion stops at the borders of the country it's happening in, or the jurisdiction it's happening in. With commerce, most of these companies are global companies, like these big companies we're talking about, not a mom and pop shop. But these big companies stratify more than just one country or one continent or one people group. They stratify all sorts of places, and it's a way for discussion to be brought to a global level that could never be brought to a global level in the halls of Washington, D.C., for example. But in the boardroom of IBM or some major corporation who has a presence in Europe and Asia and the United States and South America, all these places, you have a discussion that now has a broader context because there's more people for them to take into account. So as the discussions happen, more and more of not just the values of the people in the country that business originates have to be taken into account, but all the systems that are running, the entire ecology of the planet needs to be taken into account. And I think that's exciting because I believe that will give us, we're bound almost right now by the limits of our borders, of being able to really talk about big global issues. But corporations aren't bound by that. I mean, they have to be legally bound by taxes and things like this, but why can't corporations start to think about and tackle issues like global warming and some of these other social issues that maybe they have a hand on because they're so globally focused? They're the only players that are focused on that type of a global level. Nobody else is. In fact, entire governments aren't as free to talk about issues that affect all of us as much as corporations are. Mm-hmm. And so I have a little bit of a pushback. A lot of people demonize corporations. They demonize, sometimes the making money and having the corporation being this big entity. And I can totally see the valid points there. And then at the other end of it, I see the corporations, and as they begin to think about actual issues that impact people's lives and take those into account, and more people work for them that have these social issues on their consciousness, I could see a real change happening from the corporate level globally.
Yeah, well, I think one of the reasons why corporations do get demonized is because they have such extraordinary power and influence. And it feels like they're always using it for evil, or at least for self-serving purposes. And that might be one of the reasons why, not just a distaste of politics, but it might actually be that people recognize, because they're the power brokers, that's where you got to go in order to make global change, like you were mentioning. So the companies are being held more, like what is your position? What is your take? They're being held more accountable because people do demonize them. And so now it's not okay to just be, somebody who started a business, had rapid growth, and made a lot of money. It's now like, okay, now that you've done that, you're now in a position where you have massive impacts on a lot of different people's lives. So how are you going to use that? How are you going to use that power? Are you going to be responsible with it? We need to know how you feel about these different issues. And so this idea that companies were always like sort of neutral on all this stuff, I don't think people are allowing them to have a position of neutrality. I think we're just seeing the earliest vestiges of that. It looks like if the pattern continues the way that we've been sort of seeing the pattern continue, it might get to a point where people are not okay with that anymore. You mentioned earlier, somebody might be listening to this and going, well, I would just be happy to have a job, right? Like, yeah. I can't really be picky about which companies whether or not they're in alignment with my values or whether or not they're in integrity. So if you're gonna zoom it back in, because we're talking pretty zoomed out, we're talking on a very sort of mimetic level of how societies work. And if you zoom it in to the individual, like why is this relevant to somebody like me? And I think the reason why, in particular, looking through the lens of personal development, I think the reason why this topic is particularly interesting to me as an individual who has to make a living is that the world is clearly advancing slowly. It's like it's the barge, right? And we as individuals are tugboats. We have a lot more mobility, but the whole barge is clearly moving from one graves level to the next. It's entering a time period of not just commercial, advantageous, capitalistic Graves level 5 momentum. It's entering a place of systems thinking and ecology and how do our actions impact others? And let's look at a bigger picture. And is the impact your company making having a positive or a negative effect on all of these different people? And so that's the whole point of this conversation about taking greater responsibility, or like holding our quote unquote companies more accountable, is because we on a societal level are moving into a more, bigger ecologically thinking level. So that's where our world's going, right? And that's around the stream or the point in the stream that it's at. So where are we at? Like, are we in the middle of that? Are we trailing behind? Are we leading it in the forefront? Like, are we gonna get left behind, right, in this world? In order to make a big impact in the world, and of course, when we talk about personal development, really, I guess you could say we like sort of sneakily always interject this idea of making an impact in the world because we have a belief that the point of personal development is to be able to become the best version of yourself and get through your stuff and not be so myopic and only thinking about you and your shit and your issues, so that you can go, oh, and also there's a bigger world out there and I could actually be having a positive impact. So we're not very sneaky about it, actually. I say we sneakily say that, but we're actually pretty transparent about this idea of personal development in order to become better versions of ourselves and make an impact in the world. And so if we start to see the world like this is the direction that this developed country is at, right? This is the first world position that this country is at. Where are we in that? And this series on wealth generation or making money or a relationship with money, we just did a podcast on the cash flow quadrant, which is our, where do you fall in the model of how you're making your money and your relationship with your money, etc. I think the reason why it's so important to us to encourage people to have a positive, healthy relationship with wealth generation is because the world is headed, like it is already exiting their, whether or not they have a good relationship with wealth generation. On a global society, in order to make an impact, in order to be at the forefront and helping direct where society is going, you're going to have already had that relationship down. Like you're going to have to already have figured that piece out. And then you can be at the forefront of all this stuff. If you figured out your relationship with wealth generation and money, you now have a much more peer-oriented relation or ability or thought process, a peer thought process to the people who are the movers and shakers, to the people who are actually making an impact. So even though this is not specifically like, hey, understand that you need to be hired by a company that is in alignment with your values. That's really actually, I don't think what this podcast is about, at least from my perspective. I think this is more like, this is where the barge is at. As a tugboat, are you behind the barge? Are you running parallel with the barge? Or are you at the front of it actually pulling the barge to go the direction that you think is the most powerful? Are you actually having an impact, an influence on where society is going? And the only way to do that is to be at the front, right? To be one of the mavens, to be one of the movers and shakers. And that means that you got to get your money stuff handled.
Or at least your resource stuff handled. I think, how you're going to how you're going to live in the world, how you're going to eat. And that may not be building a corporation or owning your own business or becoming wealthy. It might be starting a nonprofit that, you help the world, but you have a paycheck that keeps you alive and keeps you fed. Like, there's got to be some way for you to eat and to figure that piece out. And I would posit that the people who have created wealth, we see story after story of somebody who's poured their time and effort for 10, 15, 20, even 30 years into a business, like a Bill Gates, makes billions of dollars, changes industries. He gets to the end of it and goes, wow, he scratches his head and goes, okay, now what? Like, I have more money than I know what to do with for the rest of my life. Well, my wife and I are going to start contributing back, and we're going to start the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And then they go and they begin to help other people because they figured out the money piece, and it's almost like they worked it out of their system. He figured that out. It was like he got through that. He's like, okay, that was interesting. I learned a lot, but now I'm ready to give back. I'm ready to do something with this. And I think that's really where, people that have come through that and then they want to give back, that's really where the goodness can come from.
Didn't we recently see that Ariana Huffington is now doing personal development stuff?
I think she's teaching on Oprah. Yeah, she's got like a course on Oprah's like online network or something. I don't know if she sold Huffington Post or not, but I don't know if I think she's transitioning into more of like a global leader teaching and stuff like this rather than business running stuff.
Yeah, and you see the people who make a lot of money and then don't graduate, like the sort of the Donald Trumps of the world, and they just keep like building and amassing more resource. And Donald Trump has a voice in this world for sure, and I think the Graves 5 world very much looks to him as sort of an icon of their level. And I don't really think Donald Trump's going to have a lot of... I mean, when he starts talking political stuff, I don't really think anybody cares. And yet those people who have almost gotten post-political, like whatever the institution is that they're supposed to be plugging themselves into, those are actually the people who are making an impact. I think those are actually the people who are getting something done. And so, yeah, like getting your relationship with resource, you said you kind of get it out of your system, but I think you also learn a lot through that as well. Like, I made an impact with business, so now I can make an impact in another way. We've been basically hitting on this topic, or like hitting on this concept, pretty much with every podcast. Get your relationship, or in this series, every podcast in the series, get your relationship with resource handled so that you are not spending all your time and energy focusing on it, and so you can refocus on making an impact in the world, if that's something that's important to you. And I think this concept of society, they don't even know why they're doing it. They're just doing it. But society holding businesses accountable on a ethical level, on a moral and ethical level, indicates that if we don't, as individuals, get our relationship with resource handled, we're gonna be trailing. Our tugboat's gonna be behind the barge. The barge is gonna be ahead of us, and our ability to make an impact is gonna be, it's going to be muted. It's going to be neutered because of that situation. So I thought this conversation was a really intriguing way of recognizing where society is at least in these, first world countries, and asking ourselves, taking a hard look at ourselves, going, where am I at in the stream of this? And am I at a place where, I'm with you. I'm at a place right now where, I've been self-employed for long enough where, I almost tell people I'm unemployable at this point. Like, I don't know if I could get hired by a company. I don't know if anybody would want me at this point because I'm like, I'm practically a corporate anarchist. I'm like, yeah, I'm not going to do that. You can't just say that to your boss. But I'm kind of at a point where I've had too much freedom, if that makes sense. I've had too much autonomy. I don't know if I could go back, but let's pretend I had to. I'm in a place where I don't know if I could be hired by a company that didn't resonate with my personal ideals. I just don't know if I could do it. And also, I feel like my relationship with resource, it was a hard-won battle, but I think I'm at a place where I have a pretty healthy relationship with resource at this point. So, like, it's really a matter of trying to get to that place where you go, yeah, I think my relationship with resource is good. I'm not demonizing it. I'm not seeing it as the savior. I'm understanding that this is just a way to stop having to focus on me and getting my Maslow basement needs met of safety and security. And so now I can refocus my attention to other stuff that doesn't have to do with, oh God, am I going to be able to pay my rent? And I feel like this is a very powerful lesson that we can learn with models like the Graves model, and then just using that lens to see where we're at in the stream of time as humans.
Yeah. So what do you think? What are your thoughts? Have you observed this trend? Do you agree with it? Do you disagree with it? We'd love to hear from you. This is a discussion starter, not a discussion ender. These podcasts are part of the discussion. You're here with us, and we want to hear from you. Thank you for listening. If you want to go to our website, you can find us at personalityhacker.com, facebook.com/personalityhacker, twitter.com/personalityhack, HACK, and join the discussion, join the community. We've got a growing group of people that are of like minds, just like you, that are joining with us every day, and we're discussing topics like this. We're helping each other grow. We've got each other's backs and answering questions and really moving personal growth forward through the lens of your unique personality, which is what we're all about here at Personality Hacker, is assisting and helping you in that. Also, please subscribe to this podcast if you can on iTunes or Stitcher or any of the other places it is. It's now available on a lot of different platforms on the web. There's several different apps for the Android as well that you can now download and listen to the podcast through your Android phone or tablet or anything that is on the Android platform. So we're expanding the reach of the podcast for more people to be able to listen and be a part of the community. And we want to have you a part of that with us.
And rate us on iTunes. I don't know how you rate on the other platforms, but I do know how you rate on iTunes.
Yeah.
And rate us on iTunes. Doesn't have to be good. Doesn't have to be a good review. We like it if it is, but it doesn't have to be.
I would prefer a
I would
good
prefer
review,
it,
but
we love feedback. So please give us feedback. Please give us a review.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. So my name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we can't wait to talk to you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.